imagine placing this like massive bet on the Super Bowl, right? But the catch is you're actually the referee actively blowing the whistle on the field.
Which is, an insane concept to even wrap your head around.
Right. But now imagine attempting that exact same level of manipulation, but instead of a football game, you are wagering on a highly classified military operation, and you're doing it on a public crypto ledger.
Yeah, leaving a totally permanent digital trail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to NovaStream. We are your 2,147 anchors bringing you live crypto markets, global financial indices, and the absolute latest breaking news feeds. Today's deep dive is dedicated to analyzing what happens when the global systems meant to protect our markets, our supply chains, and, well, our geopolitical stability begin to sort of eat themselves.
Yeah, because when you look at the live feeds today, across the S&P 500, the Forex pairs, all our geopolitical alerts, a really distinct pattern emerges. We are watching systems operating under extreme stress, specifically systems where the built-in shock absorbers have just completely failed. So whether we're looking at diplomatic channels in the Middle East, emergency oil reserves, or even the labor retention strategies of legacy tech giants, the buffers that usually absorb all this volatility are gone. We're basically operating on the rim.
Operating on the rim, I like that. So let's look at the absolute peak of that geopolitical stress first. On the macro level today, U.S. President Trump just announced a 3-week extension to the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire. And this is right after hosting envoys at the White House.
Right, so the diplomatic machinery is technically moving.
Yeah, exactly. From a diplomatic mechanics standpoint, we're looking at upcoming Washington visits from both Lebanese President Joseph Aoun and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But, I mean, when you look past the official press releases and check the real-time reporting on the ground, that diplomatic shock absorber is incredibly fragile.
It really is. And the fragility mostly comes down to the total lack of an enforcement mechanism. We're seeing major accusations and kinetic action just continuing despite this agreement. So Hezbollah rockets were recently intercepted over northern Israel.
Wow.
And on the other side, Lebanon has formally accused Israel of war crimes regarding casualties among journalists, which, we should note, is an accusation the IDF has categorically denied. And crucially, Hezbollah is refusing to even open discussions about disarming.
Right, and obviously we're just reporting the facts on the ground here, not taking sides. But without a framework for disarmament, a ceasefire is really merely a pause in logistics, right? Not an actual resolution.
Exactly.
And we absolutely cannot gloss over the human reality behind those logistical pauses either. The data shows at least 2,294 people have been killed in Lebanon, with over 1 million people displaced. The stakes for keeping this diplomatic channel open are existential.
They absolutely are.
Yet, when you pan down from that macro level of international diplomacy, you find individuals looking at unprecedented geopolitical chaos and simply trying to find a way to monetize it.
Yeah, which brings us back to that referee.
Right. Going back to that referee analogy I opened with. Okay, let's unpack this. Look at the indictment of U.S. Army Special Forces Master Sergeant Gannon Kenman Dyke. He just made over $400,000 betting on the Polymarket prediction platform.
It's wild. He allegedly utilized highly classified knowledge of Operation Absolute Resolve, which was the U.S. plan to capture Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro in Caracas.
Wow.
Yeah, he used that internal military knowledge to place his bets and then attempted a really clumsy cover-up. I mean, it exposes a massive vulnerability in modern intelligence protocols. The military apparatus is designed to detect state-sponsored espionage, not to monitor its own non-commissioned officers placing prop bets on their own deployments.
Right. It's like a referee betting on the Super Bowl while actively blowing the whistle. How does a single soldier even think they can hide bets on a public crypto prediction market regarding a classified military offering? The audacity of trying to hide that on a public blockchain is just what stands out to me.
Okay.
Because Polymarket operates on crypto smart contracts. Every single transaction is permanently etched into a public ledger. Van Dyke likely assumed that because his wallet didn't have his actual name on it, he was invisible.
Which is a huge misconception.
Huge. Modern chain analysis software doesn't need your name. It just looks at the flow of funds. It maps where the money entered the ecosystem, say from a centralized exchange hooked to a bank account, and tracks it all the way to the prediction market. The blockchain is literally the worst possible place to commit insider trading.
It really is. But the democratization of prediction markets has turned global events into tradable assets. The military never built behavioral shock absorbers for a world where a soldier can just, pull out their phone and instantly bet on the kinetic outcome of the raid they're about to execute. It
Yeah.
just demonstrates how technological platforms are completely outstripping legacy institutional safeguards.
And that concept of legacy safeguards failing transitions us directly into the commodity feeds today. We're seeing those exact geopolitical tensions in the Middle East and the Gulf completely breaking the underlying math of the global oil market.
Yeah, the oil feeds are flashing red today.
They really are. We are tracking a new report from Natasha Kaneva at JP Morgan Chase, and she's essentially outlining a systemic mechanical failure. The market is facing a supply hit of 9.1 million barrels per day. But here is the terrifying part of the math. That deficit is blowing out to 13.7 million barrels per day.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the expansion of that deficit is due to the actual physical mechanics of global shipping. An oil shock doesn't hit the entire globe simultaneously. It travels basin by basin, entirely dictated by the speed of oil tankers and the rerouting of supply chains.
So it's sort of like traffic backing up behind an accident on the highway.
Exactly. The cars right behind the crash stop immediately. But the ripple effect travels backward, causing congestion miles away, eventually pulling in side streets and alternative roads. Asia tightens first, then Europe, then the Atlantic. The logistical bottleneck actually compounds the initial supply hit.
But wait, we always hear about strategic reserves and spare capacity. Those are supposed to be the market's shock absorbers, right?
They are, yeah. Saudi Arabia and the UAE hold significant spare capacity, but according to this analysis, that oil is physically stranded behind the Gulf disruption. They have the crude, but the shipping lanes are totally compromised.
Well, what about U.S. shale? The historical narrative is always that American drillers simply turn on the taps when prices spike.
Well, the mechanical reality of U.S. shale is far slower than the market narrative. Even with prices screaming higher, capital deployment and drilling logistics take a lot of time. They can only add about 0.3 to 1 million barrels per day, and that production takes anywhere from 3 to 12 months to actually reach the market.
Wow, that's a huge lag.
Yeah. And then add in Russia, which is only providing this tiny leaking infrastructure-strained cushion of about 300,000 barrels a day, and you realize the primary release valves are just completely sealed shut.
So it's like we're driving down the highway, we blow a tire, but instead of putting on the spare, we're just driving on the rim until the axle snaps.
That is exactly what it is.
So what does this all mean for the average consumer when this supposed demand destruction hits? If the new oil can't get there for months, and the spare oil is trapped behind a geopolitical wall, the only buffer left is whatever is sitting in the storage tanks right now.
And those tanks are draining at a historic rate. The market was forced into a massive inventory drawdown of 7.1 million barrels per day in April alone. But storage is finite, because global demand for oil is highly inelastic. I mean, freight trucks can't run on good intentions, and petrochemical plants can't just pause operations. Consumers don't just naturally stop buying oil when the price ticks up a few dollars.
Right. So when the storage tanks finally hit the bottom, the only lever left to pull is what Kaneva calls forced demand destruction. The price has to rise so violently high that it physically forces the economy to stall out.
Precisely. It prices shipping companies out of moving goods, and it forces factories to shut down the assembly lines. The economic pain is the actual mechanism being used to balance the ledger.
Man, that is brutal.
It's a brutal mechanical reality, and the ripple effects of those forced adjustments and margin squeezes are showing up everywhere in our corporate indices today. Companies across all sectors are looking at these macro conditions and furiously trying to rebalance their own ledgers by consolidating.
Yeah, the entertainment sector is a perfect example of this. Warner Bros. Discovery just secured shareholder approval for a historic $110 billion merger with Paramount Skydance.
Which is just a staggering number.
It is. The consolidation play here is colossal. It forces Max, Paramount Plus, CNN, and CBS News all under one single corporate umbrella. WBD shareholders are looking at a $31 per share cash payout, which is a massive 147% premium.
Not bad for the shareholders.
Not bad at all, but the vote revealed a profound shift in corporate governance. The shareholders aggressively approved the merger, but they completely rejected WBD CEO David Zaslav's golden parachute.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was positioned for an $887 million payout, and the shareholders outright vetoed it.
That is fascinating. It really indicates that institutional investors are drawing a hard line. They're willing to approve the structural mergers necessary to survive the streaming wars, but they're absolutely no longer willing to fund executive excess while the underlying business models are under stress.
Exactly.
Furthermore, the mechanics of this merger are far from settled. The Department of Justice is heavily scrutinizing the deal on antitrust grounds. Combining two legacy film studios and two major news networks creates massive pricing power, not just in consumer streaming subscriptions, but in theatrical distribution monopolies.
Right. And while the executives and the DOJ battle over monopolies, the labor markets are absorbing the actual impact of these structural shifts. Legacy companies are pivoting aggressively. Nike just announced a cut of 1,400 tech jobs, moving to consolidate their operations into strategic hubs in Oregon and India.
Yeah, we're seeing that contraction everywhere.
But here's where it gets really interesting. We usually see tech companies executing brutal overnight layoffs, right? But Microsoft is hitting the wires today with a very different strategy. They are rolling out their first ever voluntary employee buyout program aimed at up to 7% of their U.S. workforce. But to qualify, you have to meet the rule of 70.
The rule of 70.
Yeah, your age plus your years of service must equal 70 or more.
Oh, okay. So Microsoft is targeting older, deeply tenured employees. The economic mechanics here are really fascinating. Right now, hiring across the tech sector is sluggish, but turnover is equally sluggish.
Nobody wants to leave.
Right. Employees are looking at the macro environment we just discussed and choosing to hold on to their jobs. Natural attrition is basically stalled out. So Microsoft is forced to financially incentivize attrition to clear out legacy salaries and reshape their workforce.
Is this a more humane way to shrink, or just a strategic way to bypass ageism lawsuits and sluggish attrition? Because what fascinates me is the psychological aspect of this buyout. It's not just a spreadsheet maneuver. We're looking at insights from Maggie Mulqueen, a psychologist who specializes in retirees, and she points out that taking a package like this is a massive lifestyle shock.
Oh, absolutely. Your entire identity, your daily routine, and your social cohort are tied to your corporate login.
Exactly.
She describes the experience for many as falling off a cliff. When you take the buyout, you leave the corporate ecosystem that has structured your life for maybe 20 or 30 years. If you haven't actively built a community outside of your career, you suddenly find yourself isolated in suburbia without a peer group experiencing the same transition.
Yeah, the corporate job operates as a massive social shock absorber.
It does. And when you remove it voluntarily, the isolation is profound. It forces us to ask what happens to Microsoft's institutional knowledge when 7% of their most tenured engineers and managers walk out the door simultaneously.
You lose the deep underlying architecture knowledge. And speaking of architecture, it is wild to watch legacy tech companies paying people to leave while foundational hardware companies are exploding.
Yeah, the Intel numbers are crazy today.
Unbelievable. Intel shares are surging 19.9% in after-hours trading. This is setting up to be their best post-earnings performance on record. Analysts are calling it a CPU renaissance. We're seeing a massive rotation back into the physical hardware required to run on-premise infrastructure and AI models.
Intel is really capitalizing on the realization that the cloud is still just someone else's physical computer. Foundational hardware demand is surging. But, contrast that immediate physical hardware success with a company that is currently suffocating under the weight of its own technical debt.
You're talking about Tesla.
Yes. Tesla's feed today is completely melting down.
Yeah, for a decade, Tesla has sold vehicles with the explicit promise to early buyers that their cars would eventually become fully autonomous via over-the-air software updates. The narrative was that the hardware you bought in 2016 was completely future-proof.
Well, the engineering reality has finally caught up with the marketing. The future arrived. The software demands massive compute power, and the legacy hardware physically cannot process it.
So Elon Musk unveils his new plan to fulfill this decade-old promise. If you own one of these older models, you have two choices. You can trade it in at a discount for a new car, or you can get the hardware physically upgraded.
But the catch is staggering.
Yeah, they want to upgrade these cars in factories that have not even been built yet. I have to push back hard on the logic here. Okay, wait. Tesla sold these cars with the promise of self-driving built into the price. Offering a discount on a trade-in feels like buying a house and being told 10 years later you have to buy a completely new house just to get the roof you already paid for. How is this flying with investors?
Well, this raises an important question about the legal and financial implications. From a brand liability perspective, it's a disaster. Tesla is treating physical, depreciating automotive hardware as if it were a beta software program.
Right.
The financial shock absorber for Tesla has always been the fanatic loyalty of its early adopters. By forcing those exact adopters to subsidize a massive engineering miscalculation, they are eroding the core trust of their consumer base. It is the ultimate danger of monetizing a promise before the underlying physics and engineering actually exist.
Monetizing promises with zero underlying physics brings us perfectly to our final segment. If you look at our live crypto market feeds today, we have to talk about the absolute fringe of modern speculation. Political meme coin.
Oh boy.
Yeah. The data on the Trump meme coin, which is trading under the ticker Trump, shows a total collapse. It is down 96% from its January 2025 record high, and down 80% just since his first promotional event for the token back in May.
And yet, despite the catastrophic drop in valuation, President Trump is hosting a highly exclusive gala luncheon at Mar-a-Lago this weekend. It is strictly limited to the top 297 token holders, with the top 29 receiving VIP access.
Wow, quite the guest list, I imagine.
Yeah, the guest list reflects significant institutional and celebrity curiosity. We're talking venture capitalist Tim Draper, Tony Robbins, Mike Tyson, and fund manager Cathie Wood are all expected to attend.
And obviously, we are strictly analyzing the market data and the financial structure of this asset here, remaining entirely neutral on the politics, but the financial community is pointing to some glaring structural mechanics. David Krauss, a finance professor emeritus, published an analysis showing that the token possesses absolutely no economic utility.
Not at all.
It is a pure speculative vehicle. His data shows that approximately 80% of the entire token supply is controlled by Trump-affiliated entities, and structurally, the smart contract is designed so that trading fees flow directly to the creators, resulting in over $324 million accruing to insiders regardless of the token's collapsing market price.
Which has naturally drawn heavy criticism from government oversight organizations. The watchdog group, CRDB Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, has publicly labeled the event as profiteering. In response, the White House has defended the president's involvement in the meme coin ecosystem, issuing a statement that he only acts in the best interest of the American public.
And again, we are merely reporting the data and the statements from both sides on the record. But as analysts looking at the mechanics of the gala itself, the fine print on the promotional website is a fascinating legal safeguard. It explicitly states that attendees cannot be currently in litigation with the U.S. government.
What's fascinating here is if you contrast the mechanics of this token with the oil market analysis we discussed 20 minutes ago, the dichotomy of the global financial system is just staggering. On one hand, you have the global oil supply governed by the immutable laws of physics, tanker speeds, and inelastic industrial demand. If the physical crude does not arise, the global economy grinds to a halt. On the exact same day, you have hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through a digital token that has zero physical utility, driven entirely by internet sentiment, political personality, and concentrated insider supply control.
It is the ultimate display of how wildly detached market valuations can become from physical reality, which really brings us to the core thesis of everything crossing our NovaStream feeds today.
Yeah, when you synthesize the data across all these sectors, the reality is stark. The physical pipelines of global oil are running dry, forcing prices to destroy demand. Legacy corporations like Warner Bros., Discovery, and Microsoft are frantically executing massive buyouts and mergers just to adjust their labor and capital structures to new realities. And Tesla is colliding with the physical limits of its technical debt. The entire global system is under immense multi-directional pressure, and the built-in shock absorbers, the spare capacity, the diplomatic enforcement, the consumer trust are either failing or already depleted.
And that leaves you with a critical question to consider as you monitor your own portfolios and watch these markets evolve. We have spent this entire deep dive exploring how deeply interconnected systems rely on these buffers to survive daily volatility. What happens when the next major, unpredictable global shock hits a system that has already burned through its emergency reserves, its institutional knowledge, and its diplomatic leverage? If we are already driving on the rim, what happens when we hit the next pothole?
It's a scary thought.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Make sure you keep it locked right here on NovaStream. Our live crypto charts, S&P tracking, and breaking news feeds keep rolling 24/7. We will see you next time.